whenever I meet someone new who's into horror, one of my first questions to them is, what was it that got you into the genre? And, there's a ton of answers to that from a ton of different people. And I've given more than my share of answers to that, too, because there isn't really one incident. It's really a means to get people to talk about all the things that built up to them loving the horror genre today. And certainly I can tell you about the first time I sat down and watched Psycho and how that affected me. And I can talk to you about seeing Night of the Living Dead and the original Friday the 13th and all those films on UHF stations from the 70s and 60s and 40s and 30s. And all those would be absolutely valid answers to the question, why are you into horror today? But there is a title that I think probably on a deep psychological level means more than any of them. And it's an odd bird. But I think for an entire generation, this film had particular impact. And one of the big reasons was it was simply available. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark premiered on ABC as a movie of the week on October 10th, 1973, the year of my birth. I'd been alive for a few months, but certainly I didn't see it on premiere night. I'm not sure exactly when I did see it. Probably 78 or 79 would probably be the most likely scenario. I was young. But it wasn't really until I was 10 or 11 that I really watched the film, and it had the effect that would drive me into my, at first, love-hate relationship with the horror genre, and then ultimately into a full-bore romance. You see, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is what its title claims it to be. It's a film that preys on such basic instinctual fears, and it does so in a quiet, unassuming way. And yet, it's also a film that puts its monsters right in the film. They're not hidden for very long, which seems to be a contradiction, right? We think of quiet horror as insinuation and build-up. We think of it more of the original Cat People's use of color and sound and shadow, and not so much like the obvious monster features of the 50s or 60s. But this film from the early 70s, made for television, cuts both ways. You could read this film as a purely psychological exercise in which Kim Darby's Sally is just losing her mind because of her husband's neglect and self-worth issues. Or you could read it as a monster story where these little creatures are living in this bricked-up fireplace, and when they're unleashed, they come for the last family member. I think all those are legitimate, and that's why this movie plays. It hits you on whatever level you allow it to hit you on. It's a really unassuming production. There's really no frills involved. It looks like a film not shot in 1973. And at one time, I think that would have been a roadblock for people, but I think we're growing very nostalgic for that late 60s, early 70s film look, where everything had a certain cheapness, but a cheapness that reminds us of a time when our lives were just simpler and things were less colored by the cynicism of the day. I know, in 2020, it's really hard to not be cynical about just about everything, and I'm the biggest guilty party to using dark humor and cynicism in my daily life. But Don't Be Afraid of the Dark asks us to do something else, and that's return to a time when we wouldn't be our worst audience. Through whispered voices and repetition, through just insinuation and changing allegiances, it's a challenging little film in its own right, but it's not challenging in a way that's modern at all. It's challenging in the way that great literature is challenging. It's hard not to feel for Sally, but it's also not hard to follow her husband's suspicions that she's trying to sabotage his professional life out of petty jealousy. It's a film in which all the characters' motivations are so crystal clear, if one-dimensional, that you can't help but feel like everyone actually belongs in this drama. There's no fat here. Probably the biggest criticism this film does receive is that Kim Darby as Sally is, well, she's Kim Darby. She's sort of one note and a wilting flower in most scenes. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of range. But this film is a very simple, almost English ghost story type of film. And her performance, to me, works in, again, aligning us to a simpler time, which wasn't the intent when it was made, but that's how it plays today. I also think that because she looks like a woman out of time, we're able to move past all those modern feelings of what a character would do in this situation. It almost has a fairy tale logic to it of a sort, if that fairy tale was to take place in, say, the Brady house. I don't think that younger audiences are likely to embrace this film to the level that people of my generation did and continue to. When I get together with horror fans who are my age and we mention this film, it's like with awe and reverence. And yet it's a very small, simple film. So I think for a generation that's growing up with things like The Witch and Hereditary, great films that I will scream to high heavens whenever I get the chance, but they're so complex and they're so dense that this may seem almost pointless. It might seem no more complex than your average Scooby-Doo cartoon. But it was so important for so many of us, and I think it holds up for what it is. Is it as scary today as it was back then? I don't know. I've seen the film so many times, I can't help but celebrate it for entirely different reasons than the person seeing it for the first time today. I suspect, however, that if you allow yourself to view it for the first time from an unbiased perspective, you'll understand what this film did to people my age. Now, it would appear on television irregularly, but I remember every time I saw that listing in that free television guide that came with the Sunday newspaper, I wouldn't just circle it like I circled many things. I would circle it as deeply enough, probably to cut it out of the newspaper, because this was a can't miss every time it aired. It was released on VHS, and it wasn't really very available for most of the cable years that followed after UHF became less prominent. But today you can get this very nice Blu-ray from Warner Archive, and it looks great, and it feels great, and it still feels and looks like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. Now, before I go, I guess I have to discuss the remake. But I'd rather not. It's a film that misses the entire point of the original. I think it was made by people who do feel the way I do about the original, but they were so concerned with making it relevant for a new audience, for a new age, that it is almost painfully wrong-headed. My recommendation is to skip that entirely. But if you haven't seen Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, it comes with my highest recommendation, but also a plea to go in with the right mindset and to think about what this film accomplished for an entire generation. This is the film, in many ways, that defines people born between 1970 and 1980, who now make up a core portion of the horror audience.